Long before the rise of the Maya, the Aztec, or the Inca, a far older civilization thrived on the dry coast of Peru. Known today as Norte Chico or Corral Supi, it is the oldest urban culture in the Americas, dating back over 5,000 years. Yet this ancient society left behind no fortresses, no weapons, and no evidence of war. Instead, they built massive pyramids of stone, vast circular plazas, and sustained their people not with fields of grain, but with fish from the sea and cotton from the river valleys. Who were these mysterious builders, and how did they flourish in peace when the rest of the world seemed bound by conflict? For decades of research, what has most astonished archaeologists about Norte Chico is the near-total absence of violence. Throughout human history, the rise of ancient cities has almost always been tied to warfare, since expanding territory, controlling resources, and protecting populations required military strength. In Egypt, massive armies were organized to defend the Nile and the Great Pyramids, symbols of pharaonic power. In Mesopotamia, from Sumer and Akkad to Babylon, stone steles and ancient inscriptions recorded victories and campaigns undertaken to consolidate royal authority. War, it seemed, was the universal formula for building and sustaining state power. Yet, in Corral Supi, a barren stretch of land along the Pacific coast, where dozens of the earliest urban centers in the Americas emerged, around 3000 BCE, archaeologists have found no traces of weapons, defensive walls, or bloody clashes. This silence of war here is not merely an exception, it fundamentally challenges our traditional understanding of how human civilizations were built. Excavations at key sites such as Corral, Aspero, and Banderia have all led to a unified conclusion that leaves archaeologists perplexed. There are absolutely no traces of swords, spears, arrows, or bronze daggers, nor any massive defensive walls surrounding the settlements. Instead of preparing for war, the inhabitants seem to have devoted their collective energy to monumental public works, stepped pyramids built of earth and stone, sunken circular plazas used for communal rituals, and simple rows of dwellings for daily life. This strikingly different choice raises a fundamental question: how could a society with such a large population and complex organization maintain order and stability without relying on the tools of warfare that were present in nearly every other civilization of the same era? One widely supported hypothesis suggests that Norte Chico built its power and maintained social stability through religion and economic cooperation rather than military force. The sunken circular plazas, regarded as centers for collective rituals, may have played a decisive role in reinforcing community cohesion. When thousands gathered together to take part in ceremonies tied to shared beliefs, they not only shared spiritual experiences, but also strengthened their trust in an order that transcended individual interests. In a context without warrior kings or symbols of military authority, these sacred rituals created a sense of unity, acting as an invisible glue binding individuals into a larger collective. Thus, religious faith may have replaced the fear of war, becoming the foundation that allowed society to function in order and stability for centuries. In addition to religion, the prosperity of Norte Chico also stemmed from the unique natural environment of a coastal civilization. An abundant food supply of dried fish, seafood, and resources from the rivers allowed its people to secure their basic needs without resorting to violent competition. In this context, the exchange of goods became the foundation for maintaining social order. Residents traded fish and seafood for cotton, to weave textiles, crops from agricultural zones, or construction materials from neighboring areas. This multi-directional network of exchange created a natural balance of power. Every community had something to contribute, and each depended on the others. As a result, instead of forming armies for plunder, Norte Chico sustained social stability through the circulation of goods and the shared benefits of trade. What is most astonishing is that even without relying on warfare, Norte Chico was still able to create monumental works that required the massive mobilization of human labor. Tens of thousands of loads of earth, stone, and other materials were transported by hand to build stepped pyramids rising dozens of meters high, along with vast ceremonial plazas. In the wider panorama of world history, such grand constructions are usually tied to the power of warrior kings figures who wielded both weapons and divine authority, asserting their status through lavish palaces, imposing statues, and inscriptions glorifying their conquests. Yet in Carol, there were no palaces reserved for rulers, no statues of kings to immortalize personal power, and no stelae praising the achievements of a single individual. The absence of these symbols of personalized authority reveals that social order here was not enforced by the domination of a ruler, but rather sustained through shared belief, collective cooperation, and a communal system of organization that rose above individual ambition. The greatest mystery lies in this: how could a large and complex community like Norte Chico maintain peace for centuries? Did they truly never experience conflict? Or have the traces of violence simply failed to survive over time? Some cautious scholars suggest that everyday life may still have involved minor disputes over land, water, or trade. But these were so limited in scale that they left no clear archaeological evidence. However, other researchers have been bolder, proposing that Norte Chico may have been one of the very few societies in human history to succeed in eliminating warfare from the formula of civilization. If this hypothesis is correct, then their case is not merely an exception, but a remarkable testament to humanity's ability to build social order and prosperity without the coercion of violence. If the hypothesis that Norte Chico eliminated warfare from its developmental process is true, then this civilization stands as a unique testament to humanity's ability to build society on cooperation and religious faith rather than violence. This compels us to reflect on a fundamental question: is war truly the inevitable path leading to the formation of states and cities, or is it merely one of many experiments history has carried out? The case of Norte Chico suggests an alternative vision, where people could achieve order and prosperity through consensus and collective belief. Their existence not only challenges the traditional notion of war's inevitability, but also opens the possibility that human history could have taken many different paths, among which peace might serve as the very foundation for creating a great civilization. Ironically, it was precisely the centuries of peace that rendered Norte Chico faint in humanity's memory. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where warriors and empires left their mark through grand chronicles of conquest, Norte Chico had no battlefield heroes, no monuments glorifying victories, and no inscriptions recording campaigns. This civilization quietly achieved its own brilliance, with stepped pyramids and vast ceremonial plazas, only to gradually fade from the current of history. And perhaps it is this very silence of violence, the absence of war in their story, that stands as the most profound message left to posterity that a civilization can indeed be great, achieving order and prosperity without the sword or the bloodshed of battle. When we hear the word pyramid, the mind almost instinctively travels to Egypt, colossal tombs rising from the desert, built to immortalize the pharaohs. But what if the world's first monumental pyramids weren't in Africa at all? In the windswept Soup Valley of Peru, more than 5,000 years ago, step pyramids began to rise from the earth, centuries before the Maya built their towering temples in Central America. At Caral, the heart of this mysterious civilization, the largest pyramids stretched across vast plazas and climbed nearly 18 meters high. Built from millions of stones and layers of earth, these structures rivaled the grandeur of anything Egypt or Mesopotamia achieved. Yet they emerged in total isolation, on the far side of the world. What astonishes archaeologists and researchers the most is the completely different purpose of the Norte Chico pyramids. In Egypt or Mesopotamia, pyramids were inseparable from the image of powerful pharaohs' tombs, built to eternally affirm individual authority. Yet in the Soup Valley, there are no traces of royal burials, no golden coffins, no carefully preserved mummies, no hidden treasures meant to flaunt wealth. Instead, when excavated, archaeologists uncovered only ashes from ritual fires, musical instruments made from bone and seashells, and a few simple ceramic vessels. This reveals a striking truth. These monumental structures were not intended to honor a single individual, but may have been built to serve the community as a whole. They seem to have been sacred spaces where collective rituals took place, where ceremonies strengthened social bonds, and perhaps where large communal events unfolded, reflecting a civilization that placed its focus on spiritual life and communal harmony rather than on personal power. The deeper researchers delve, the more perplexing the mystery of the Norte Chico pyramids becomes. Throughout human history, colossal structures of this scale could only be realized under an absolute central authority, one capable of mobilizing and controlling the labor of thousands over long periods of time. In Egypt, that authority was the pharaoh. In Mesopotamia, it was warrior kings figures who wielded both religious and military power. Yet at Caral Soup, what astonishes scholars is the complete absence of these familiar symbols of authority. There are no palaces proclaiming the presence of a ruling class, no monuments or reliefs carved to immortalize the name of a supreme leader. Instead of a recognizable face behind the enterprise, what remains is silence, as though power itself had dissolved. Hidden within the collective, this very void raises the central question: who, or what, possessed the influence to unite people and sustain such a monumental undertaking? One prominent hypothesis suggests that power in Norte Chico did not rest in the hands of a king or military leader, but instead was concentrated within a priestly class, those who controlled rituals and religion. They acted as the bridge between humans and the supernatural, and through sacred ceremonies, they transformed belief into a force that bound the community together. In this context, pyramid construction was no longer an act of coercion, but a sacred duty, a gesture of reverence toward the divine. These monumental structures could be seen as man-made mountains, where humans recreated the grandeur of nature to forge a meeting point between the earthly and the sacred. If this hypothesis is correct, then what sustained Norte Chico was not the might of swords or warfare, but the invisible power of collective faith, a form of authority so enduring that it maintained order and stability without the need for violence or conquest. Another line of interpretation emphasizes the socio-economic factors behind the construction of the Norte Chico pyramids. This was a unique civilization in which prosperity did not depend on warfare, plunder, or the accumulation of personal wealth. but rather on a network of exchanges involving essential goods, seafood from the coast, cotton for textiles, and crops cultivated in the fertile valleys. This system of exchange created a balance of power and resources among village communities, preventing any single individual from rising high enough to become an absolute ruler. Within this context, the collective need for ceremonial and gathering spaces became the decisive force that drove people to build pyramids together. These monuments thus served both as symbols of shared authority and as proof of cooperation that extended beyond ordinary tribal boundaries. The absence of individual names tied to the pyramids may reflect a culture that placed extraordinary value on the collective, elevating communal interests above the self, a phenomenon exceedingly rare in the history of human civilization. Yet the greatest mystery still lingers. Why? Was power in Norte Chico anonymous? Could it be that the people deliberately chose not to worship or deify any individual in order to prevent the rise of a centralized monarchy? If so, they were ahead of their time, choosing a path entirely different from most other civilizations of the era. Another hypothesis suggests that the passage of time has erased the traces leaders may once have existed, but left behind no archaeological evidence for us to find. This very void makes Norte Chico an extraordinary enigma, a society capable of constructing monumental architecture, yet leaving no face or name to embody authority. It is a question with no definitive answer, and precisely the kind of mystery that continues to draw scholars deeper into investigation. Although it remains impossible to determine exactly who directed their construction, the pyramids of Norte Chico still convey a profound message. Architectural greatness does not necessarily have to be tied to personal power or imperial ambition. Unlike empires where tombs and palaces were erected to assert the authority of a ruling elite, here the monumental structures reflect the strength of communal cooperation, shared belief, collective unity, and goals that rose above individual interests became the invisible mortar binding thousands of people together in building works that have endured for millennia. Norte Chico demonstrates that collective strength, when guided by faith and solidarity, can achieve wonders no less remarkable than those produced by the most militarily powerful civilizations in history. If in Egypt, the pyramid was the eternal home of the pharaohs, symbolizing immortal personal power, then, in Caral Soup, the pyramid became the shared home of the entire community. This contrast reveals a fascinating perspective. Humanity has many different paths to build civilization. The people of Norte Chico chose a unique path, where authority bore no individual face, but instead dissolved into the collective, into shared rituals, and into the sacred bond between humans and the divine. This very choice gave them a distinctive identity, making Norte Chico a rare example of a society built on faith and consensus rather than coercion or force. Among the countless enigmas of Norte Chico, one stands out as the most unsettling: the complete silence of the written word. At a time when Egypt was carving hieroglyphs into stone, Mesopotamia was pressing cuneiform into clay, and Harappa was inscribing mysterious symbols. Caral Soup left behind nothing: no tablets, no inscriptions, not even a shard of pottery marked with signs. A civilization of tens of thousands, with pyramids and vast plazas, but not a single written record. How could such a complex society thrive, govern, and endure without the very tool we consider the cornerstone of civilization, writing itself? One of the most intriguing hypotheses put forward by scholars is that Norte Chico may have already known and used the quipu, a system of knotted cords that would later become famous in the Inca Empire thousands of years afterward. A quipu is a collection of colorful cords on which knots are tied at different positions to represent numbers, data, and even abstract messages. For the Inca, this seemingly simple tool became the foundation for managing a vast empire stretching over thousands of kilometers, allowing them to control population, collect taxes, monitor harvests, and record significant events. If the hypothesis that Norte Chico had already used quipu as early as 2000 BCE is correct, it would not only push back the origins of this unique tradition by many centuries, but also establish Norte Chico as the earliest cradle of a language of chords found nowhere else in the world. This very ability to store and transmit information through strings has led many researchers to suggest that Norte Chico may have pioneered an entirely distinct developmental path for Andean civilizations, demonstrating that collective memory and human creativity could, at times, replace writing in sustaining a complex society. Some important archaeological evidence has strengthened this hypothesis, namely the discovery of primitive quipu fragments at Corral and several other settlements in the Soup Valley. Although scientists cannot yet definitively determine their function, the structure of the cords and the way the knots were tied show clear similarities to the later Inca quipu. These cords may have been used to record quantities, agricultural products, or community events. If this hypothesis is confirmed, it would mean that Norte Chico followed an entirely different path from most other ancient civilizations. Instead of leaving traces of writing on clay, stone, or papyrus, they transformed cords and knots into their own unique form of language, a medium for transmitting collective memory in an extraordinary way. The choice to use quipu instead of traditional writing also reflects the distinctive character of the Norte Chico civilization. This was a society without kings or warrior classes, where power and knowledge were not concentrated in the hands of a small elite but spread throughout the community. Information was likely preserved and transmitted mainly through collective rituals, communal memory, and social activities, rather than fixed texts. In this context, the quipu became an effective tool for supporting memory, functioning almost like a primitive community computer that ensured accuracy in managing harvests, distributing resources, and facilitating exchanges. This flexibility may have allowed Norte Chico to maintain stability and growth for centuries, even without possessing a writing system like that of Egypt or Mesopotamia. However, the mystery of the quipu does not end with its role in calculations or record-keeping. Recent studies suggest that this knotted cord system may have gone far beyond the function of recording numbers, carrying the potential to transmit stories, laws, or even collective memory. Archaeological evidence and statistical analyses indicate that the position, color, and arrangement of knots could encode information far more complex than we once believed. If Norte Chico had already laid the foundation for this tradition, it would mean they may have invented an ancient language of knots, unique, unprecedented, and still undeciphered. Such a system of symbols, leaving behind no fixed texts, could nevertheless enable society to transmit and preserve information across centuries, proving that writing was not the only path for humanity to safeguard memory and ensure the functioning of civilization. This opens up a broader question: could Norte Chico be the root of all Andean civilizations? For after them, almost every society in the region, from Chavin and Moche to the Inca, bore the same hallmark: the absence of writing and the presence of quipu or substitute symbolic systems. This distinctive trait has led many scholars to argue that Norte Chico laid the foundation for a developmental path entirely different from the rest of the ancient world. Instead of carving messages into stone or writing on paper, they discovered a way to preserve collective memory through chords and knots. Relying on communal memory to maintain the continuity of society, this path not only allowed subsequent generations to sustain stability, but also forged a unique cultural identity of the Andes, where memory and ritual held greater importance than fixed texts. Norte Chico stands out as a remarkable exception in world history because of its divergence from what has long been considered the standards of an ancient civilization. For centuries, scholars have defined civilization based on four fundamental elements: the rise of cities, social stratification, large-scale public works, and writing. Most great civilizations such as Egypt, Mesopotamia, and ancient China fulfilled all four of these criteria, yet Norte Chico completely lacked writing. While still managing to develop a complex society of tens of thousands of people and monumental step pyramids, this challenges traditional understanding. Perhaps writing is not an absolute prerequisite for a society to reach the level of civilization. If Norte Chico could exist and prosper without a writing system, then perhaps it is time for scholars to reconsider the very concept of civilization that has been deeply ingrained in academic thought for centuries. From a modern perspective, Norte Chico seems to demonstrate that a society can maintain cohesion without writing, relying instead on collective memory, rituals, and shared beliefs. The quipu chords were not merely tools for recording, but symbols of a culture that valued communal connection over political or legal texts. This stands as evidence that there are many possible paths to sustaining a complex society beyond the traditional reliance on written language. To this day, research on the quipu of Norte Chico remains in its infancy, limited mainly to analyzing the structure of the chords and the style of knots without being able to decode the content within. Yet many scholars believe that if this system is ever deciphered, we may uncover stories tied within the strings, a treasury of history never before known, preserved through the most unique method humanity has ever devised. At that moment, Norte Chico would not only be recognized as the cradle of Andean civilization, but also as living proof that memory and language can exist in many different forms, far beyond the boundaries of traditional writing. When archaeologists excavated Carol's Soup alongside the stepped pyramids, one of the most striking and distinctive architectural features they found was the presence of massive circular plazas. These were usually built deep into the ground, with diameters ranging from several dozen to over 100 meters, surrounded by gently sloping stone steps that led people down into the central space. The repeated appearance of this architectural form across multiple settlements suggests that they were not isolated structures, but rather a shared symbol of a social order. What truly took place inside those enormous circular plazas? Archaeologists have uncovered countless clues that reveal a vibrant spiritual life, from the layers of ash left behind by sacred fires, the traces of ritual burning pits, to finely crafted musical instruments made from animal bones and seashells. All of these suggest a large-scale ceremonial scene where hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people gathered together. In that space, they may have sung loudly, kept rhythm with drums, listened to bone flutes echoing into the night, and witnessed the sacred fire blazing, a powerful symbol connecting humans with the divine. Remarkably, in a society without grand palaces or fortified walls, it was these circular plazas that became the true heart of the community. There, people not only found spiritual connection, but also reinforced social bonds, feeling themselves part of a greater cosmic order. From the perspective of many scholars, the foundation of Norte Chico society did not rest on military might, but on spiritual power religion. In Egypt, pharaohs combined both divine authority and armed force to maintain order, and in Mesopotamia, kings were immortalized in glory on battle stelae. But in Caral Soup, the highest authority belonged to the priestly class. They did not need swords or armies to compel obedience. Instead, they relied on solemn rituals, music, and sacred symbols to instill faith. Within the vast circular plazas, the priests created a kind of religious stage, a place where the community collectively witnessed and experienced the sacred. These ceremonies not only reinforced spiritual belief, but also reaffirmed social order, forming a spiritual framework that no one dared to break. Thus, power came not from violence, but from collective faith, a form of governance built on voluntary participation and communal cohesion rather than coercion. What astonishes researchers is that, although Norte Chico left behind no divine carvings, no grand monuments, and no majestic temples, they still maintained a belief system strong enough to mobilize thousands of people into building monumental works. This raises a challenging question. What kind of faith held such power so great it could transform collective labor into a sacred mission? We find no written records that mention the names of their gods, nor any concrete images showing how they were worshipped. Yet what seems to have existed in the collective consciousness was a cosmic order, a shared belief that humanity and nature were bound together in a sacred balance. It was precisely this invisible but unshakable faith that became the driving force behind the creation of vast communal works, from stepped pyramids to sunken circular plazas, and even urban networks stretching across hundreds of kilometers. All of these reflect the organizational strength of a civilization built upon spiritual conviction rather than coercion. Some theories suggest that the religion of Norte Chico was closely tied to the natural cycles, from the flow of rivers, the rhythm of the sea, to the fertility of crops. When examining the placement and arrangement of their structures, researchers noticed hints of astronomical alignments, especially those connected to the movements of the sun and the moon. It is possible that the circular plazas once served as spaces where people reenacted the cosmic order through collective rituals. Blazing fires symbolized the sun. The rhythm of bone drums evoked the lunar cycle, and the very circle itself represented the eternal cycle of renewal. These ceremonies were not only prayers for abundant harvests and plentiful water, but also declarations that human society must function in harmony with the heavens. This may well have been the profound message the Norte Chico civilization embedded in their unique architecture. From a sociological perspective, the circular plazas of Norte Chico carried a meaning far beyond mere architecture. They symbolized ritual equality. Within these round spaces, there was no division of high and low, no privileged position reserved for a single individual. Everyone from ordinary people to the spiritual elite faced the same center, where a sacred fire or holy symbol would be placed. This very arrangement created the feeling that all participants were part of an eternal circle, sharing a religious experience on equal terms. It stood in complete contrast to the pyramids of Egypt, where power was concentrated at the peak, representing the exaltation of one supreme individual. In this sense, Norte Chico seemed to choose a different path in history, building communal cohesion through shared faith. Rather than turning religion into a tool for reinforcing the authority of a single ruler. The greatest mystery lies in the fact that we still do not know exactly what the people of Norte Chico worshipped. There are no traces of a sun god like the Inca revered, nor any symbols of a storm god as seen in Mesoamerica. Instead, what remains are ashes, bone and shell instruments, and the sunken circular plazas, perhaps themselves symbols of eternity. Some scholars suggest that, for Norte Chico, religious faith did not reside in concrete divine figures, but in the collective experience of the sacred. When the community gathered for rituals, listened to music, and watched the sacred fire blaze, they felt a transcendent power surrounding them. It may have been this shared experience, rather than any visible deity that formed the core of the belief system, binding their entire society together. If this hypothesis is correct, then Norte Chico opened a unique path in human history, a society that could flourish without the need for a powerful army or the absolute authority of a king. Instead, the force that bound tens of thousands of people together came from a shared faith, an invisible belief system strong enough to transform collective labor into a sacred duty. What is astonishing is that the entire process of building pyramids, circular plazas, and urban networks stretching for hundreds of kilometers left behind no trace of coercion. There was no war, no weapons, no scenes of mass enslavement. The only thing that remains is evidence of a profound collective belief, a spiritual order that everyone respected. And the greatest unanswered question is this: exactly what faith was powerful enough to inspire them to create such a radiant civilization? When we think of ancient civilizations, we picture the stern faces of Egyptian pharaohs carved into stone, or Mesopotamian reliefs immortalizing kings and their conquests. Yet in the barren coastal valleys of Peru, the world's first cities rose without leaving behind a single human face. Excavations at Caral, Aspero, and Banduria revealed grand pyramids, vast circular plazas, and primitive quipu, but not one statue of a god, not one portrait of a ruler, not even the faintest trace of an individual's likeness. A civilization that thrived, yet chose or somehow lost the art of showing itself. The visual silence of Norte Chico is a great paradox that leaves archaeologists deeply puzzled. In nearly every ancient civilization, visual art was inseparable from the affirmation of power and the reinforcement of religious belief. The pharaohs of Egypt had statues erected to proclaim their immortality and divine authority. Mesopotamian stelae carved victories into stone, turning kings into eternal symbols. Mayan reliefs narrated myths that legitimized the role of the elite. Yet in Norte Chico, all such traces are absent. No portraits, no carvings, no works of personal art have been found. This absence is not merely a physical void, but also opens a chain of questions about cultural meaning, social philosophy, and how the people of Norte Chico understood the very nature of power. A prominent hypothesis suggests that the absence of faces in Norte Chico was not accidental, but rather a deliberate cultural choice. The people there may have considered sculpting statues or depicting human figures unnecessary, even contrary to the collective philosophy of their society. In a civilization where the community was more important than the individual, emphasizing the portrait of a leader could have been seen as disrupting balance and fostering division. Instead of glorifying power through personal images, they allowed it to dissolve into collective rituals, monumental architecture, and the quipu, knotted cords used for recording information. Towering pyramids, circular plazas where the community gathered, and quipu preserving shared memory became the true faces of this civilization. Here, power was not personalized, but transformed into a collective symbol, deeply tied to common belief and the strength of the community. A more cautious approach suggests that the disappearance of imagery in Norte Chico may simply be because its entire artistic heritage has not survived to the present day. This civilization developed in a harsh coastal environment where earthquakes, floods, and climate change occurred frequently, easily destroying fragile artifacts. If the people of Norte Chico once created wooden statues, paintings on fabric, or works made from organic materials, all of them could have decayed or been buried over time. The fact that we have not yet found evidence does not mean they never existed. The very nature of archaeology is like an incomplete mosaic, pieced together from fragments that have survived through millennia. So today's silence may only reflect the limits of what has been preserved. Regardless of which hypothesis is correct, the absence of faces in Norte Chico still creates a rare uniqueness in human history. It raises a challenging question. Can a civilization achieve prosperity without personal symbols or figurative art? Norte Chico seems to answer yes. They did not leave behind grand monuments carved with victories or myths in stone, but instead left their mark through collective spaces where thousands of people gathered for rituals, shared beliefs, and strengthened communal bonds. The pyramids, circular plazas, and orderly urban systems themselves became living evidence of the endurance of a society that did not exalt individuals, yet still achieved extraordinary collective strength. Some scholars go even further, suggesting that the facelessness of Norte Chico reflects a philosophy of collective anonymity. The absence of portraits, reliefs, or individual carvings may reveal a deliberate intention to blur the boundaries between leaders and the community. In such a context, no one was exalted above others. All were merged into a single whole, and the community itself became the only face of the civilization. This stands in sharp contrast to Egypt or Mesopotamia, where power and personal imagery were always tied to eternity. It was precisely this unique form of organization that created Norte Chico's distinct identity, making it a rare exception in ancient history. Yet the mystery remains: if power was truly anonymous, then who directed the tens of thousands of laborers in building massive pyramids, vast circular plazas, and an entire complex urban system? Could it really be that all this work was carried out over decades, solely through the absolute voluntary effort of the community, without any form of centralized leadership? Some hypotheses suggest that there may indeed have been a powerful priestly class, but that they deliberately avoided leaving behind any image of themselves. In order to preserve the transcendence and mystique of their authority, it is precisely this silence, the complete absence of individual traces, that has made Norte Chico such a difficult historical puzzle, where each new discovery only deepens the veil of mystery surrounding this ancient civilization. In a certain sense, the facelessness of Norte Chico suggests a philosophy that feels strikingly modern. The strength of a community does not necessarily have to be tied to the image of a single individual or leader, but can arise from shared belief and collective cohesion. This reality offers an intriguing contrast to today's society, where people often tend to glorify heroes, idolize leaders, and see them as the center of success. Norte Chico presents a different model. Endurance is not built upon extraordinary individuals, but upon the ability to sustain common trust and unity within the community. This may serve as a profound lesson for the modern world about what truly forms the lasting strength of a society. Ultimately, Whether the absence of monuments and carvings in Norte Chico stemmed from a conscious cultural choice or was simply the result of lost heritage, it has become one of the greatest mysteries associated with this civilization. Unlike other ancient empires that asserted their power through images and portraits, Norte Chico left to posterity a shadow of history powerfully present through its pyramids, plazas, and social structures, yet never revealing a face. It is precisely this absence that makes the civilization so distinctive, leaving a lasting impression on the imagination of later generations, a civilization without portraits, yet enduring through collective strength and monumental architectural legacy. When we think of the world's first great civilizations, we picture fertile rivers, the Nile nurturing Egypt, or the Tigris and Euphrates shaping Mesopotamia. But on the arid coast of Peru, an entirely different story was unfolding. Here, the Norte Chico civilization rose not from golden fields of grain, but from the endless ocean and its narrow rivers. Their economy didn't rely on wheat or barley. Instead, it thrived on the sea's bounty, seafood, and dried fish, a foundation so unusual that it sets Norte Chico apart as one of the most extraordinary exceptions in human history. At the coastal settlement of Aspero, archaeologists uncovered sediment layers filled with fish bones, seashells, and traces of seafood, revealing that the people of Norte Chico had once stockpiled vast amounts of food from the sea. Anchovies and sardines, once caught, were dried for long-term preservation and then transported deep inland. Meanwhile, in river valleys such as Supa and Patavilca, inhabitants cultivated cotton, squash, beans, and other crops, yet agricultural output was insufficient to sustain the entire population. This imbalance drove the creation of an interregional exchange system. Dried fish from the coast became the principal commodity traded for cotton and produce from the river plains, forging an economic network that tightly bound coastal and inland communities together. Although located on the arid coast of Peru, Norte Chico was still able to sustain a large population and construct monumental structures thanks to its unique economy. Abundant dried fish and seafood provided a steady source of protein, while agricultural products from the river valleys such as cotton, squash, and beans supplied essential fiber and energy. This harmonious combination created a sustainable economic foundation, ensuring food security while enabling society to thrive. Moreover, the exchange system between sea and river acted as a binding force, closely linking coastal and inland communities together and forming a complex, dynamic network. What was remarkable in Norte Chico is that dried fish was not only consumed as food, but also functioned as a form of currency within the economy. Archaeological studies show that dried fish was widely traded, becoming a strategic commodity to consolidate power and maintain social stability. While in Egypt, gold and grain were the measures of wealth, in Norte Chico it was seafood that formed the basis of prosperity. Thanks to these reserves, the priestly and ruling classes could organize religious ceremonies, mobilize labor to build pyramids, and sustain a complex social system, turning dried fish into a symbol of the entire civilization. Yet the mystery lingers. How could one of the earliest complex civilizations of the Americas rely on dried fish? Could something so simple and ordinary truly sustain tens of thousands of people for centuries? In reality, it was the stability and long shelf life of dried fish that provided a decisive advantage. In the harsh environment of Peru's coast, with scarce rainfall and limited arable land, dried fish became the safe reserve, a durable, portable, and easily exchangeable food supply. This story once again affirms that the path to civilization is never just one. If Egypt had the Nile, Mesopotamia had fertile plains. Then, Norte Chico had the ocean with its endless supply of fish. From that, they created a unique economic system where food replaced gold and silver, and where dried fish became the foundation of an ancient urban society. This is one of the most distinctive features, and also a great mystery, of how humans discovered many different ways to step into the world of civilization. When we picture the wealth of ancient civilizations, glittering treasures of gold, silver, and precious gems usually come to mind. But in the mysterious land of Norte Chico, true power rested in something far humbler: cotton. Archaeologists have unearthed telling clues, delicate strands of ancient fibers, fragments of woven cloth, and even fishing nets spun from soft, white cotton. In a world where dried fish and seafood sustained life, this simple plant fiber became their white gold, a hidden resource that fueled an entire civilization. In Norte Chico society, cotton was not merely a material for weaving cloth, but a lifeline for the entire fishing system. Coastal communities depended on large, durable nets to exploit the Pacific Ocean's abundant fish, while inland valley settlements specialized in cultivating cotton, turning it into a valuable commodity for trade. Fish from the sea were carried inland in exchange for cotton. Cotton from the valleys returned to the coast to be woven into nets. This circular flow not only sustained economic exchange, but also bound communities together into a network of mutual dependence, where cotton became the key that connected and ensured balance for the entire civilization. From the perspective of power, cotton was not merely an agricultural product, but a crucial tool for controlling society. Whoever controlled the distribution of cotton also held influence over the fish supply, the very foundation of community survival. The ruling elite and priestly class could organize labor, oversee cultivation, and regulate the production of nets, thereby indirectly managing the output of marine resources. In this way, cotton became the basis of authority, replacing gold and silver seen in other civilizations. This striking difference shows that Norte Chico proved wealth did not have to come from precious metals, but from any resource that carried strategic value for survival. However, this very reliance on cotton opens up a puzzling mystery. Why did such a flourishing civilization as Norte Chico leave behind no metallic treasures at all? In Egypt, the tombs of the pharaohs gleamed with gold and jewels as symbols of power. In Mesopotamia, artifacts of bronze, silver, and gold appear abundantly across archaeological sites. Yet at Caral Soup, all that remains are cotton fibers, fish bones, and stone constructions. The complete absence of metals has forced scholars to seek explanations, with two main hypotheses most often put forward. The first hypothesis suggests that Norte Chico never developed metallurgy. The Peruvian coast was rich in biological resources, abundant in seafood and fertile land for agriculture, but poor in metallic minerals. The extraction and crafting of copper or gold likely had not yet emerged during this era. Instead of seeking rare metals, they focused on utilizing the essential resources available: cotton and fish, to sustain daily life and support the growth of their society. The second hypothesis suggests this may have been a deliberate cultural choice. The people of Norte Chico did not seem to view gold or silver as symbols of power or status. Instead, they valued practical resources tied directly to survival: cotton for weaving fishing nets, fish to nourish the community, and massive collective constructions to unite society all reflected a very different philosophy. While many other civilizations placed material wealth and precious metals at the center of authority, Norte Chico built its strength on essential needs and communal solidarity. Whichever the case, the fact remains undeniable. Norte Chico thrived without metallic treasures, and this is precisely what made them unique, even challenging the very definition of civilization, which is often tied to gold, silver, and weaponry. For Norte Chico, cotton was gold, the element that illuminated and sustained the existence of one of humanity's earliest civilizations. Around 1800 BC, something extraordinary happened. On the coast of Peru, the Norte Chico civilization, once radiant with pyramids and circular plazas, suddenly vanished as if it had dissolved into thin air. There were no traces of war, no ruins of fire or invasion, and no evidence of earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. All that remained were abandoned structures, empty cities, and a haunting silence in history. It was as if the inhabitants had all left at once, leaving behind a mystery that humanity has yet to solve. What do you think could truly explain the silent disappearance of Norte Chico? Was it climate change, internal collapse, or something we still haven't uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. This creates a profound paradox in human history. For most ancient civilizations, we know their endings were marked by tragedy, etched into humanity's memory through war, collapse, and destruction. Ancient Egypt, after its golden age, declined under waves of foreign conquests. Mesopotamia, the cradle of writing and the world's first cities, was caught in an endless cycle of wars and shifting political powers. The Maya left behind magnificent cities swallowed by the jungle, testimony to centuries of environmental crisis and social upheaval. Yet Norte Chico stands as a complete exception. There was no tragic finale, no cataclysmic event to close their chapter. This once thriving civilization seems to have chosen to vanish in silence, leaving no final story for archaeologists to record. And it is precisely this silence that has made Norte Chico one of the deepest and most haunting enigmas of the ancient past. To explain this mysterious disappearance, scholars have proposed several theories, with one of the most prominent pointing to climate change. The Peruvian coast is strongly influenced by the El Niño phenomenon, an abnormal shift in ocean currents and sea temperatures. When El Niño strikes, rainfall patterns can change suddenly, triggering prolonged droughts or erratic floods, while simultaneously depleting coastal fish stocks. For an economy almost entirely dependent on seafood, dried fish, and marine products to feed its people and serve as trade commodities. Such disruption was nothing less than severing the lifeline of the entire society. As the fish vanished, food stores dwindled, trade collapsed, and the socio-economic foundation of Norte Chico began to crumble. In that context, the population may have been forced to disperse, abandoning once sturdy monumental structures in search of new lands. This fragility in the face of climate change has led many scholars to believe that the fall of Norte Chico stands as a stark reminder of nature's silent yet relentless power of destruction. Another explanation emphasizes the possibility of internal disintegration within Norte Chico society itself. This was a civilization that did not rely on weapons, warfare, or metals to maintain power, but instead on community cohesion, religious faith, and collective rituals. Such a soft foundation made them especially vulnerable when confronted with internal pressures. A growing population could have created tensions in resource distribution, while disparities between coastal communities rich in marine resources and inland groups with fewer means might have sparked conflicts of interest. If the priestly class, who acted as mediators and unifying figures, lost their authority, or if rituals that once served as the spiritual pillars of society lost their influence, the entire structure could gradually weaken. Once common faith was broken, the cooperative foundations that had fueled prosperity could rapidly collapse without the need for any war or conquest. This was the dark side of a system built more on belief than on violence. Once that belief fractured, even the most seemingly solid achievements could crumble into dust. Some scholars have proposed that Norte Chico did not truly disappear, but instead transformed into the successor civilizations of the Andes. Core elements of their social organization, from the quipu system, a method of record-keeping with cords and knots, to governance rooted in ritual and religion, may have been adopted and developed by later cultures such as the Chavín, Nazca, and Inca. The legacy of Norte Chico, therefore, could be hidden within the symbols, customs, and political religious structures we usually associate with these more famous civilizations. If this hypothesis is correct, then Norte Chico never really vanished, but rather dissolved into the flow of history, becoming an invisible yet essential foundation. Precisely because this continuity is so subtle, tracing their true influence has remained elusive, leaving scholars to debate endlessly about the real place of Norte Chico in the broader tapestry of Andean history. Whichever theory we follow, the truth remains unsettling. A civilization that endured for millennia, that once built monumental structures and complex societies, could suddenly vanish without leaving a clear trace. There was no bloodshed, no conqueror carving his name into stone walls, no natural disaster leaving scars of destruction. What remains is only an absolute absence, a cold silence in history that forces us to wonder how an entire prosperous society could dissolve so quietly, as if it had never been there at all. Perhaps it is this very silence that has made Norte Chico one of the most mysterious civilizations in the world. While most of human history is remembered through bloody wars, devastating plagues, or violent social upheavals, Norte Chico left behind an entirely different ending, a quiet retreat, almost invisible. This forces us to reflect that history is not always written in dramatic tragedies, but sometimes in the silent disappearance of a once flourishing community. And this event raises a troubling question for our present. If a civilization could vanish without a sound, then could modern societies with all their technology, power, and prosperity one day fade into oblivion in the very same way? In the silence of its ending, Norte Chico left behind a profound lesson for humanity. A civilization is not defined solely by glittering treasures, carved stone inscriptions, or towering statues, but also by its fragility in the face of natural upheavals, the limits of social order, and the collective beliefs that bind its people together. Norte Chico may have vanished from the map of history, yet its quiet departure has become an eternal reminder that no civilization, no matter how radiant or powerful, can guarantee absolute permanence. All are vulnerable to being swept away by time and circumstance, leaving behind a void that forces later generations to ask, are we, too, walking the same path as Norte Chico once did, only with an ending that may come faster and more unexpectedly